our reaction, the immediate reaction to her resignation, is that it is overdue. She should have done this at least a week ago. I'm happy to see that. I'm happy to see that she has heeded the call of both Republicans and Democrats. Now we have to pick up the pieces. We have to rebuild the American people's faith and trust in the Secret Service as an agency. It has an incredibly important responsibility in protecting presidents, former presidents, and other officials in the executive branch, and we've got a lot of work to do.
Secret Service Director Kimberly Cheatle is out, resigning this morning after widespread bipartisan calls to step aside, and a day after a grueling appearance on Capitol Hill where she faced sharp questions from lawmakers angry about the assassination attempt of former President Donald Trump. Cheatle admitted to security failures and took full responsibility for the lapses that led to the shooting. But it wasn't enough to keep her job. Here to break down this story and more, The Hill's White House reporter Brett Samuels. Brett, it was hard to see, especially after her performance on the Hill and just how heated lawmakers were over the security lapses, that Cheatle could hold on given the severity of what happened. Why did she endure such a grilling by lawmakers? I think everyone likely saw the writing on the wall even before she testified.
Yeah, for sure. This resignation from the Secret Service director, I think it's fair to say, felt a bit inevitable, really, just in the past few weeks. Certainly it was not a surprise when Republicans, in the wake of that assassination attempt, came out and called for her job, called for her to step down. But when you had Democrats, including Congressman Jamie Raskin, essentially saying that she needed to step aside, she needed to resign, it was, as you said, hard to see how she could keep her job. And then that appearance on Capitol Hill, where she endured just hours of really tough questioning from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, just kind of drove home, I think, how much bipartisan outrage there was over this and how Director Cheatle had really just lost confidence, I think.
Her resignation comes as House Speaker Mike Johnson and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries announced the creation of a bipartisan task force to investigate the assassination attempt. Brett, how will this panel operate and what is expected to come out of it?
Yeah, so this is, kind of a rare occurrence, I guess, on Capitol Hill of sort of bipartisan cooperation here. There's supposed to be, or expected to be, 7 Republicans, 6 Democrats on this panel. There's actually pretty significant interest, I think, from lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to be part of this investigation. They'll have subpoena power. They'll be able to talk to who they need to talk to sort of get to the bottom of the breakdowns that led to the assassination attempt against former President Trump at his Pennsylvania rally. So I think we would expect to see something of a comprehensive report on what exactly led to the issues at that Pennsylvania rally security-wise. I would also expect to see recommendations about how the Secret Service can improve on this, what needs to be done to prevent future lapses like this. We heard Director Cheatle herself say that they needed more staff. Perhaps the report will address that, but certainly something I think we'll see just in the coming days. We should see lawmakers appointed to serve on this panel and this task force moving forward.
Turning to 2024, it's been less than 2 days since Biden ended his re-election bid, and Harris has all but locked up the nomination. Brett, there's plenty of talk about an open process throughout this. How do we get here so quickly, though? Will Democrats wait until the convention or make Harris the official candidate before then?
Yeah, we heard, as you mentioned, sort of these calls for some kind of open process, for some kind of competitive primary to determine who the nominee would be for Democrats. I think some folks are wary of the perception of Kamala Harris being sort of crowned the nominee or anointed the nominee without going through the process. But the reality is, delegates have already lined up to pledge their support to her. She's done the outreach to state and local officials, to federal lawmakers. She's been doing the work, as she said she would do, to lock up this nomination. And so, there doesn't appear to be any serious challenger for her to defeat for this nomination. And so now the expectation is that the Democratic National Committee will hold sort of a virtual, essentially, nominating process just a couple weeks before that convention in Chicago on August 19th. And at that point, we'll see Harris as the official Democratic nominee.
She's certainly generating a lot of enthusiasm there in the Democratic Party. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer just endorsed Vice President Harris. Has she all but solidified her position then as a Democratic nominee?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say she's got this pretty much locked up. As you mentioned, Senator Schumer and Congressman Jeffries, the Democratic leaders in the Senate and the House, respectively, those were kind of the two big, I think, outstanding endorsements that we're still waiting to see for Vice President Harris. They came through, obviously, today on Tuesday, and they said that she has their full support as the nominee because she's gotten the support of those delegates to become the likely nominee at this point. So, there really doesn't seem to be any appetite for a challenger. The party's excited. They're united behind Harris. Former President Obama is basically the only person of note, I think, in the Democratic Party who hasn't come out and said he supports Kamala Harris as the nominee. So he may be one to watch, but otherwise, it really does seem like the party's very excited and united behind Vice President Harris here.
The big question about Harris at the top of the ticket is whether she will fare better against Trump than the numbers showed Biden would. Brett, what does the recent polling tell us about Harris?
Yeah, so, the limited data that's available shows that Vice President Harris fares somewhat similarly to President Biden in the sense that she trails former President Trump in a lot of national polls, including in some swing state polls, battleground polls. She's behind former President Trump. But there are some signs that she may fare better than President Biden. There was a New York Times Siena College poll that showed Harris faring better than Biden in Virginia, which, Democrats would be in trouble if Virginia is truly a battleground state that could go red in November. That poll showed her 5 points ahead of Trump, where it showed Biden a couple points behind Trump. So that's one example of where she might fare better. It also showed her faring similarly to Biden against Trump in Pennsylvania. So, I think in the next couple of weeks, we'll see a really significant amount of polling, I would expect, showing what a Harris versus Trump race would look like now that appears to be the case that we're going to get that. But as of now, the polls suggest that Harris is on a pretty similar track to Biden, but of course she doesn't have the advantage of having been out there as the nominee for years or months or whatever it was with Biden. So certainly I'd expect in the next few weeks we may see some fresh polls and some changing numbers.
Harris's team says they've raised more than $100 million since Biden dropped out, with more than 1.1 million unique donors, meaning roughly 62% of those contributed for the first time. Brett, that's a massive haul. Walk us through these fundraising numbers and what her war chest, her donors, tell us about the momentum of her campaign.
Yeah, it's a huge fundraising haul for Vice President Harris. And I think, they touted that they had a record-setting amount of donations just in the first 24 hours after President Biden stepped aside and backed Harris as the nominee. And then, from Sunday afternoon when Biden stepped aside through Monday evening, they raised about $81 million. So it's really a staggering number. And I think what it tells us is that Democrats are really excited about this change at the top of the ticket. There had been reporting that President Biden was struggling to raise money in the aftermath of that June debate performance, that big dollar donors were kind of closing their wallets, saying they didn't want to give more money to Biden if he remained the nominee. And that doesn't seem like that's going to be a problem for Vice President Harris, as evidenced by the grassroots enthusiasm, these first-time donors who are giving money to her campaign, and also big name donors like George Clooney, for example, who have said that they're willing to do whatever they can to help. So certainly, I think it says that the Democratic Party is really revitalized, rejuvenated, and really excited about this change atop the ticket.
Yes, the money game will certainly be key to her success along the way. Now, Republicans have spent years going after Biden, his family. They've even considered impeaching him, really just highlighting his every weakness at every turn. Now they have to quickly refocus on Harris and pivot the attacks. What's their strategy?
Yeah, they've sort of previewed, I think, in just the first few days, kind of I would say it's like a three-prong approach kind of that they'll take to attacking Vice President Harris. The first being they're labeling her the border czar, quote unquote, which refers to the assignment that Harris took on in the first year of the Biden administration in addressing root causes of migration from Central America and Northern Triangle countries. So she was not in charge of the southern border, but she was in charge of, kind of addressing why so many migrants were coming to the southern border. And so Republicans are jumping on that to attack her over immigration. The second issue is they're tying her to Biden administration policies on the economy and inflation, essentially, saying Biden's record on that is her record on that. It's one and the same. And then third, we're seeing them, the Trump campaign and their allies, really go after Harris over this idea that she was involved in some kind of cover-up or was misleading the public about President Biden's physical and mental fitness and ability to do the job and handle the presidency, that she was constantly praising him and his sharpness And now in the last few weeks, obviously, we've seen, a lot more talk about whether Biden is up to the job. And of course, that culminated in him stepping aside. So I think those are sort of the lines of attack that we're going to see really front and center in the weeks and months to come from Republicans going after Vice President Harris.
Now, Harris is really a different challenger from Trump. She is younger than Biden, for one, a woman of color. Is age now going to become a major disadvantage for the former president?
Yeah, I think, we had seen when Trump was running against Biden that Trump himself was kind of reluctant to talk specifically about age, that he would always make it about competency and whether Biden was up to the job or any good at the job, because obviously the difference in age was pretty small between Biden and Trump. And a lot of polls showed that voters wanted new candidates, younger candidates, a new generation. With Vice President Harris, that sort of argument is totally gone. And now Democrats actually have the advantage where they can say, like, we have, the young candidate, the generational change candidate. Harris is only 59, Trump is 78, and Trump becomes sort of the historically old presidential candidate. So certainly, I think it'll be worth watching whether Democrats actually try to flip that and go on offense against Trump and question whether he's too old for the job, whether he's up to doing the job for 4 more years, where he'd be 82 at the end of a second term.
Democrats are pushing Harris to look at Midwestern governors for her choice for VP. Now, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear is under consideration, and he's already out attacking Trump's vice president, J.D. Vance. Brett, what more can you tell us? Who else is among the potential Harris VP picks? It looks like Beshear is basically out there auditioning.
Yeah, certainly we've already seen some of these folks, putting themselves on TV and sort of stoking speculation, I think, about whether they are being considered to join Harris on the ticket. A Democratic official told me that the Harris campaign has sent vetting materials to a handful of prospective contenders to be Harris's running mate. And that includes Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly, the Arizona senator. It also includes Gretchen Whitmer, the Michigan governor, as well as Tim Walz, actually, who's the governor of Minnesota. So those are the names that are sort of initially percolating. Obviously, Andy Beshear, as you said, the Kentucky governor, his name has certainly been out there. J.B. Pritzker, the Illinois governor, his name has been out there. So, those folks have all been on TV. They've all been pretty prominent ever since Biden stepped aside. And as you said, I think Democrats would like to see Harris maybe lean into a choice from a battleground state, and that would, maybe favor Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania or Mark Kelly in Arizona. But certainly, I think this will be probably the most closely watched story in Washington for the next couple of weeks here, as Harris sort of settles on who will join her on the ticket here.
We've talked about some of the endorsements that Harris has received, but vulnerable House Democrats are pretty excited about her likely nomination. How does Harris versus Biden help Democrats up and down the ballot in November?
Yeah, that was, I think, a really big driving factor behind this push to get Biden to step aside just in the last couple of weeks. Was Democrats down the ballot were essentially freaking out about what his struggles at the top of the ticket would mean for them down ballot. We saw a lot of vulnerable lawmakers. John Tester in Montana came out and said that Biden should step aside. We saw other House Democrats in competitive districts say he should step aside. And those folks have all pretty much rallied behind Vice President Harris as the nominee. Tammy Baldwin, a senator in Wisconsin who's facing a tough reelection fight in November, was one of the first senators to come out and say that she supported Harris as the nominee. So I think certainly sort of the angst and anxiety that we saw about Biden and what he would mean for down ballot Democrats, that's sort of gone away. People are excited about Harris. The fundraising totals, I think, kind of speak to that, to the excitement and the confidence that people have now. So certainly it's sort of a new day for the Democratic Party, and they're feeling much better about their chances up and down the ballot in November.
And many congressional Democrats are pretty relieved they don't have to keep focusing on Biden's age, for one. Now, Biden is set to address the nation tomorrow night in his first remarks since exiting the 2024 race. Has the White House given any indication of what we can expect him to say? Up until now, we've really only had a paper statement from the president put out on X.
Yeah, this will be, his first sort of on-camera remarks. He spoke on the phone. He called in to campaign headquarters on Monday as Vice President Harris made her first visit there since Biden had stepped aside. But certainly a lot of focus will be on these Wednesday night remarks from the Oval Office. The expectation that we've heard from the White House is that President Biden will both kind of lay out his decision to step aside and not seek a second term. And on top of that, he'll also describe to the public kind of how he plans to serve out the remainder of his term and what he'll prioritize in these last 6 months or so that he's in the White House. I'd expect him to touch on efforts to secure a hostage release deal in the Middle East, for one, to continue to work on bringing down prices would be another thing I would expect to hear from the president. But certainly, I think that'll be sort of the main focus will be both why he's not running for re-election and what he plans to do in the time he does have left in the White House.
Turning to news out of Washington, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in Washington and will give a joint address to Congress tomorrow. What will he focus on in his address, and how are lawmakers, particularly Democrats who are often divided on Israel, responding to this visit?
Yeah, so this is kind of a significant moment, I think, for the Israeli prime minister. You know, it's a chance for him to have an audience with U.S. lawmakers, some of whom are maybe a bit skeptical about his leadership in Israel and his handling of the war against Hamas in the Middle East. I would expect to hear from the prime minister, both thanking the U.S. for their support in their war against Hamas. Obviously, the U.S. has provided a lot of weaponry, a lot of money to support Israel. And on top of that, I would expect him to kind of lay out the path ahead, how he sees this war coming to a conclusion and sort of beyond the war, what he sees as the future for the region. Democrats, we've already seen a number of Democrats saying that they won't be attending Netanyahu's address. That includes Vice President Harris, who's the president of the Senate in her role. She'll actually be in Indianapolis for an official event, so she won't be there for this address. And there'll be plenty of other Democrats who I think are skipping this because they have lost confidence in Netanyahu. They're frustrated by Israel's handling of this war and how it's killed thousands of Palestinians in Gaza. So certainly it'll be interesting to see sort of the reception Netanyahu gets from Congress.
Instead of presiding over Netanyahu's address, Harris is actually having a separate private meeting with Netanyahu. And we also know that Biden is going to have his own meeting with the Israeli prime minister. What can we make of this? Does this move signal a shifting stance at the top of the Democratic ticket?
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the most notable differences between President Biden and Vice President Harris is Vice President Harris has, when she's spoken about the conflict in Gaza and the situation in the Middle East, she has at times gone a little farther than President Biden has in terms of calling out Israel, saying that what Israel's doing is unacceptable, calling for more humanitarian aid to get into Gaza. So, and that's been a big issue, I think, for President Biden with Democratic voters when he was still running for re-election. And young voters in particular were really frustrated by his support for Israel and his sort of, his pledge for ironclad support for Israel, despite what was happening in Gaza with civilian deaths. So that meeting between Vice President Harris and Prime Minister Netanyahu will certainly be one to watch, especially now that Harris is the likely Democratic nominee. But certainly, she's been outspoken about some of her concerns with Israel's conduct. So we'll see if she raises those in that meeting and what the White House has to say about Netanyahu being in town this week.
And with Netanyahu addressing lawmakers, what type of protests can we expect to see?
Yeah, certainly, there's sort of an expectation, I think, a preparation for some protests, both among lawmakers who are going to skip the address in protest. We've already heard Senator Tim Kaine, for example, of Virginia, skipping the address. There is a plethora of progressive Democrats in the House who are expected to skip Netanyahu's address to Congress. And on top of that, there's been fencing that's put up around the Capitol, sort of in anticipation of civilian protests. Certainly, I would expect to see, hundreds, if not thousands of people on the streets of D.C. Protesting his arrival, protesting his remarks to Congress. This has been a really hot button issue that has sparked protests for months now. So certainly having the prime minister in town will, I think, reignite some of those frustrations and would expect to see folks take to the streets to make their displeasure known with Benjamin Netanyahu in town.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you. The Hill's White House reporter, Brett Samuels.
Thank you.
Democrats and Republicans are banding together to investigate the assassination attempt on former President Trump. House Speaker Mike Johnson and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries are assembling a bipartisan task force to examine the shooting at Trump's rally in Butler, Pennsylvania earlier this month. The task force will be comprised of 6 Democrats and 7 Republicans, with a likely vote on the resolution Wednesday evening. The task force will require 2/3 support of the chamber for adoption, with many in the House expecting sweeping bipartisan support needed for approval. Former President Trump is pushing for a New York appeals court to throw out his civil fraud judgment. Trump's lawyers urged the court to toss the nearly $500 million judgment, calling it an unauthorized, unprecedented power grab. The judgment was placed on Trump after a state judge ruled he altered his net worth on key financial statements to receive tax and insurance benefits. The ruling deals a major blow to the former president's business empire and personal funds as he seeks to secure a second term in the White House. The Department of Justice is asking the Supreme Court to partially restore President Biden's Title IX rule in red states. The DOJ is taking to the High Court for an emergency action to restore parts of the rule in a handful of Republican-led states where the new regulations are blocked. The Education Department in April rolled out a final set of sweeping changes to the landmark anti-sex discrimination bill in government-funded schools. The new rule covers discrimination-based sexual orientation cases and those on gender identity. The change drew swift and harsh criticism from the right, triggering numerous lawsuits. The federal judge's decision will prevent the administration's rule from taking effect in 15 GOP-led states while the cases play out in court. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Margaret Chadbourn. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.